A relaxing vacation can turn terrifying in a matter of minutes. What would you do if the place you rented for a peaceful stay started revealing dark and disturbing secrets? Tonight, we're diving into 8 disturbing true Airbnb horror stories shared by real guests who experienced the unexpected. Some of these encounters are shocking, unsettling, and difficult to explain. As you listen, ask yourself how you would react in the same situation. Stay until the end for the creepiest story, and subscribe to Bleak Fears for more chilling true horror stories. I rented a place in Vermont for a long weekend in October. Me and my girlfriend, Mara, just needed to get out of the city for a bit. We'd been saving up, work had been brutal, and we just wanted trees, cold air, and nothing to do. We found this cottage on Airbnb, a little lakeside place about 40 minutes outside of Burlington, listed under some guy named R. Holt. The photos looked incredible. Exposed wood beams, a stone fireplace, a dock that stretched out over the water. 4.8 stars. 60-something reviews, all glowing. We booked it immediately. The drive up was perfect. That specific kind of Vermont autumn where the trees look almost fake, like someone turned the saturation up too high. We got there around 4 p.m., used the lockbox code R. Holt had sent us and walked in. The place was exactly like the photos, maybe even better in person. Smelled like cedar and something faintly herbal. Mara said it smelled like someone's grandmother's house, but in a good way. We dropped our bags, opened a bottle of wine, and sat on the dock until it got too cold. That first night, nothing happened. We ate pasta, we watched the lake go dark, we went to bed early. It was exactly what we needed. I remember thinking, genuinely thinking, this is a perfect trip. The second morning is when things started to feel slightly off. Not alarmingly off, just off enough that I noticed. I went to make coffee around 7 a.m. and the bag of ground coffee we'd brought from home was already open. I was pretty sure I hadn't opened it yet. Mara was still asleep. I stood there in the kitchen staring at it for probably 30 seconds before deciding I must have opened it the night before without thinking. We'd both had a few glasses of wine. I made coffee and forgot about it. Around noon, I went out to the small storage shed at the side of the cottage to find a canoe paddle. The listing said there were kayaks and paddles stored on the property. The shed was unlocked. I found the paddles, but I also noticed a folding chair set up in the corner of the shed facing a small, high window. The window looked directly toward the cottage's back deck. There was a dent in the dirt floor in front of the chair, like something heavy had been set there repeatedly. The thermos, maybe. I looked at the chair for a long moment. Then I grabbed the paddle and walked back to the cottage and didn't say anything to Mara because I didn't want to ruin the trip. That's the thing I keep coming back to. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to ruin the trip. We kayaked for a couple of hours, came back, made lunch. In the afternoon, Mara went to take a nap in the bedroom and I sat on the couch with a book. The cottage had that deep, old house silence, the kind where you can hear the building settle. At some point, I heard something that I first thought was the house settling. A creak from somewhere toward the back, past the kitchen. I put the book down and listened. Nothing. I got up, checked the back door locked, checked the side door off the kitchen locked, walked through the cottage and found nothing. Went back to the couch, picked up the book, heard it again, closer. I want to be clear about something. I am not someone who spooks easily. I grew up in a farmhouse. I know what old buildings sound like at rest. This was not that. This was weight on floorboards. Slow, deliberate, and then nothing. I stood very still in the middle of the living room and I realized I was holding my breath. Then Mara called from the bedroom asking if we had any ibuprofen and the spell broke and I went and found the ibuprofen and told myself it was the pipes. Second night. This is where it stops being something I could explain away. We'd gone to bed around 11. I woke up at, I think, 2:17 a.m. I checked my phone. I don't know what woke me. The bedroom was cold. Not just cool. Actually cold, like a window was open. I reached over and Mara was there. Asleep. I lay there for a minute orienting myself. Then I noticed the bedroom door was open. I had closed that door before we went to sleep. I always close doors, it's just a thing I do. Mara will tell you the same. I close every door in any space I'm in. It's automatic. The door was open about 8 inches, and from where I was lying, I could see straight down the short hallway into the living room. The fire had burned down to almost nothing, just faint orange glow. But it was enough light to see by. And I am telling you, I saw the shape of someone sitting in the armchair by the far window. I did not move. I did not breathe. I stared at that shape for what felt like a very long time. It was perfectly still, just sitting there, facing the window, not facing us. Just sitting in the dark in someone else's rental cottage at 2 in the morning like it was the most normal thing in the world. I reached over and grabbed my phone off the nightstand without taking my eyes off the doorway, opened the flashlight, pointed it down the hall. Empty chair. I got up, checked every room. Every door, every closet, the space under the bed, the bathroom, the pantry off the kitchen. Nothing. No one. All exterior doors still locked from the inside. I stood in the kitchen at 2 a.m. in a cottage in Vermont telling myself I'd been half asleep. That the shapes your brain makes in low light when you're not fully awake are not real. That there is a perfectly reasonable explanation for all of this. I did not sleep for the rest of that night. Morning 3. Last full day. Mara could tell something was wrong with me and I finally told her. The shed, the coffee, the footsteps, the door, what I thought I saw. She went quiet in a way that made me realize she'd been collecting her own things and hadn't said anything either. She told me that the first night, while I was in the shower, she'd found a coffee mug on the kitchen counter that she hadn't put there. Already used, brown ring inside, still faintly warm. She'd washed it and put it away and told herself we must have had a mug before she remembered us not having made coffee yet. She told me she'd found a cigarette stub on the dock, ground into the wood at the far end. Neither of us smokes. We looked at each other across the kitchen table and made a decision without saying it out loud. We started packing. Before we left, I walked the property one more time. I don't know what I was looking for. I went back to the shed. The folding chair was gone. The thermos-shaped dent in the dirt was still there. I walked around the perimeter of the cottage and found, along the north-facing wall, beneath the bedroom window, 2 cigarette stubs. Same brand as the one on the dock. Ground into the dirt. There was a patch of flattened grass there like someone had stood in the same spot many times. He had a spot. Beneath our bedroom window. He had a regular spot. We got in the car and we drove. I called Airbnb from the road. Reported everything, the shed, the cigarettes, the mug, the chair, the noises. The representative was polite and said they'd investigate and offered us a partial refund. I asked them how long our Holt had been hosting on the platform. She paused and said she couldn't share that information but that the concern would be escalated. I looked up property records for the cottage address when we got home. Our Holt had owned that cottage for 22 years. He listed it on Airbnb 4 years ago. He still lived, according to public records, at an address roughly 3 miles down the same road. 3 miles is nothing. 3 miles is 10 minutes on a rural road. 3 miles is close enough to drive over at midnight and sit in someone else's chair and stand beneath their bedroom window and smoke a cigarette and feel, I don't know, feel whatever he felt standing there. Feel like it was still his. The review we left was detailed. We wrote everything down. Within 48 hours, Airbnb removed the listing. I don't know if that means they found something or just decided the liability wasn't worth it. Our Holt's account is still active. He just doesn't have any listings showing right now. I think about Mara's face at the kitchen table that morning. The way she described washing that mug and putting it away and deciding not to say anything. We'd both been separately collecting evidence that something was wrong, and separately deciding to stay quiet about it so we didn't ruin the trip. He was counting on that. I think that's what I can't shake. Not the footsteps, not the shape in the chair, not even the spot outside our window. It's the fact that he knew us well enough after one night to know we'd stay. He knew the kind of people who book a 4.8-star lakeside cottage in Vermont in October. People who don't want to make a fuss, people who want to believe the explanation, people who will wash the mug and put it away. He'd had 4 years of guests to figure that out. I almost didn't go to Barcelona alone. The original plan was me and 2 friends from university. A whole 10-day trip we'd been planning since January. Then one of them got a visa issue and the other one backed out 3 weeks before, and I'd already booked the flights, already taken the time off work, already told everyone I was going. So I went alone, 26 years old, first solo trip to Europe, and I told myself it would be character building or whatever people say when they're slightly terrified but too stubborn to admit it. The Airbnb I'd booked was in Elborn. A neighborhood I'd read was good for first-timers. Central, walkable, close to the market, close to everything. The listing showed a 6th-floor apartment in one of those narrow old Barcelona buildings where the elevator is roughly the size of a coffin and the staircase spirals up around it in this beautiful, vertiginous way. 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, a small balcony overlooking an alley. The host's name on the listing was Carl's. 4.9 stars, over 90 reviews. I'd read through at least 20 of them before booking. Everyone loved it. Everyone mentioned how responsive Carl's was, how clean the place was, how the neighborhood was perfect. I landed at El Prat at 6 a.m., took the Aerobus into the city, dropped my bag at a cafe and waited until check-in time at 3. Walked around, ate a sandwich standing up at a counter somewhere, felt that specific exhausted aliveness you get from being somewhere new after a red eye. By the time 3 o'clock rolled around, I was running on fumes and just wanted to shower and sleep for 2 hours. Carl's had sent the entry instructions the night before I flew out. Building door code 4471. Apartment on the 6th floor, Unit 6B. Key lockbox attached to the door handle, code 2209. Simple enough. I typed the building code into the panel by the street door, heard the buzz, pushed through into the lobby, took the elevator up, which was, as advertised, barely big enough for one person with a rolling suitcase. Got to the 6th floor, found the door marked 6B at the end of a short hallway, found the lockbox exactly where Carl said it would be, punched in 2209, popped it open, took the key, unlocked the door. The first thing I noticed was the smell. I don't know how to describe it except to say it was the smell of a space that had recently been occupied. Not stale, not musty, recently lived in. Takeaway containers and sleep and someone else's sweat. I stood in the doorway and told myself some guests had just checked out and the cleaner hadn't been in yet. That happens. That's a normal Airbnb thing. I stepped inside. The apartment was exactly like the photos. Small entryway, then a living room with a low sofa and a round coffee table, a kitchen along one wall, the balcony door straight ahead. To the left, a short hallway to the bathroom and bedroom. Everything looked clean enough on the surface. But the smell persisted. And there was something else, a glass of water on the coffee table. Not empty. Full. Or nearly full. I put my suitcase down and stood there looking at that glass of water. It was possible a cleaner had left it. It was possible a previous guest had left it and the cleaner hadn't noticed. It was possible a lot of things. I was exhausted and I was probably reading into nothing. I went to the kitchen, ran the tap, drank some water and went to check out the bedroom. The bedroom door was half closed. I pushed it open. The bed was unmade. Not slept in and hastily straightened. Not just wrinkled from sitting. Genuinely, fully unmade, sheets pulled back, pillow dented, like someone had gotten up from it not long ago. And on the floor beside the bed, a pair of shoes. Men's shoes. Worn, cheap canvas things. Just sitting there beside the bed like their owner had stepped out of them 10 minutes ago. I backed out of the bedroom, went back to the living room, picked up my phone and called Carl's. No answer. Sent him a WhatsApp. Hi, just checked in. Looks like maybe the previous guests left some things behind. The bed isn't made either. Can you send the cleaner? Sent. 2 gray ticks. Not read. I told myself I'd wait. I sat on the edge of the sofa and opened Instagram and tried to decompress from the flight. I'd been sitting there maybe 8 minutes when I heard it. A sound from the bathroom. Not the pipes. Not the building settling. Water running. Like a tap. Turned on briefly. Then off. Then silence. Then the specific soft sound of careful, deliberate movement. There is a particular quality to the fear that hits you when you realize you are not alone in a space where you are supposed to be alone. It doesn't arrive slowly. It doesn't build. It drops through you all at once, from your throat to your stomach, and your body makes a decision before your brain has finished processing. I was on my feet before I'd consciously decided to stand. I grabbed my suitcase handle and my phone and I moved to the apartment door in about 4 steps and I had my hand on the latch when the bathroom door at the end of the hallway opened. He was youngish, maybe late 20s, maybe 30. Dark hair, unshaved, wearing a gray t-shirt and jeans. He was barefoot. He looked at me and I looked at him, and for a genuinely insane moment neither of us said anything. Then he said something in Catalan I didn't understand. His voice was low and even, like he was trying not to alarm me, which somehow made it more alarming. Then he switched to Spanish. Then haltingly in English, "This is wait, please. Wait." I did not wait. I pulled the door open and I went into the hallway and I hit the elevator button once and then gave up on the elevator and went through the stairwell door and went down 6 flights of stairs with my suitcase bumping every single step, and I did not look back until I was out the street door and on the pavement, and I walked fast with no destination for about 2 blocks before I stopped and put my back against a building and tried to breathe. He did not follow me. I stood there for a long time waiting for him to come through the building door. He didn't. I called Airbnb from the street. The wait time was apparently 17 minutes. I stood on that pavement in Elborn at 3:40 in the afternoon with jet lag pressing down on me like a physical weight, and I waited on hold. When someone picked up, I told them everything. The rep asked me to confirm the address and the listing. Went quiet for a bit. Then told me that according to their system, the previous booking had been a 4-night stay that ended. And here is the part that made me feel sick 3 days ago. 3 days ago, the previous guest had checked out. The apartment had sat empty for 3 days before my check-in. Except it hadn't sat empty. Airbnb escalated it, arranged a hotel for me for that night at their expense, and said they'd be in contact with the host. I messaged Carl's twice more that afternoon. He finally responded at around 8 p.m., by which point I was showered and horizontal in a hotel bed near Passeig de Gracia. His message said, and I'm reconstructing this because I screenshotted it but then lost the screenshot when I changed phones, that he was deeply sorry, that he had no idea anyone was in the apartment, that he would be contacting police. He used the word intruder twice. He seemed genuinely upset, or at least his message read that way. 4.9 stars. Over 90 reviews. He had no idea. Here's what I pieced together later, partly from a follow-up message from Airbnb and partly from my own obsessive Googling in the hotel room that night instead of sleeping. Barcelona has a significant issue with what locals apparently call ocupas, squatters who move into vacant properties, sometimes very quickly after a previous occupant leaves, and are notoriously difficult to remove legally once established. 3 days of vacancy was apparently enough. He'd gotten in somehow, possibly a copied key, possibly through a window. The building is old enough that the security isn't exactly sophisticated, and he'd been living there for 3 days, sleeping in the bed, drinking water from the tap, keeping quiet. He'd been there when Carl sent me the check-in instructions. He'd been there when I was on the plane. He'd been there when I was dragging myself around Elborn killing time until 3 o'clock. He was there the whole time in the apartment I was about to walk into, and the plan, I assume the plan, I don't know for certain, was to keep being quiet and invisible for however long he could get away with it. What I cannot stop thinking about, even now, is the moment in the bathroom. The tap, that brief sound of water running and then being shut off. He'd heard me come in. He'd heard me moving around. He'd been standing in that bathroom for however many minutes I was sitting on the sofa, deciding what to do, whether to stay hidden, whether to come out, what to say. The wait, please wait in 3 languages. He'd rehearsed it, or at least he'd thought about it. He'd had a plan for when a guest showed up, and the plan was to be calm about it. Low voice, hands probably open, no sudden movements, not threatening, just a man in someone else's bathroom explaining himself in the gentlest possible way. That is somehow the most unsettling part of all of it. Not the shoes by the bed, not the glass of water, not even the footsteps. The calm. The practiced, specific, deliberate calm of someone who had thought through exactly how this conversation was going to go. I stayed in Barcelona for the rest of the trip. I even enjoyed it, mostly. New apartment, different neighborhood, smaller host, 3.7 stars, but the lock worked and I checked every room before I put my bag down. I still do that now, every single time, in every Airbnb I've ever stayed in since. Every room, every closet, behind every shower curtain. Every single time. We weren't even supposed to stay there 2 nights. The original plan was 1 night at the lake house, drive back Sunday, be home before dinner. But we arrived and the place was so genuinely beautiful that we looked at each other across the kitchen, and without saying a word we both opened our phones and pushed our Monday morning stuff around to make room for one more night. That is the kind of place it was. The kind that makes you rearrange your life a little just to stay inside it longer. It was listed as a secluded lakefront retreat, outside a small town called Dwight, about 2.5 hours north of Toronto. The photos showed a long wooden deck that ran the full width of the house and hung out over the water. Pine trees on both sides so dense you couldn't see the neighboring properties. A stone fireplace. A kitchen with one of those deep farmhouse sinks. A master bedroom with a sliding glass door that opened directly onto the deck, so you could lie in bed and see the lake. We booked it for our first trip away since the wedding. Nothing extravagant. Just us. Just quiet. Just a chance to breathe together without the noise of the last few months. The host's profile showed a man, mid-50s by the look of the photo, standing on what appeared to be that same deck. Name was Glenn T. 4.8 stars. The reviews mentioned how peaceful it was, how well-stocked the kitchen was, how Glenn was always responsive. We checked in using a code on a lockbox by the front door. No issues. Glenn had texted a welcome message that morning that was warm and detailed. Firewood location, Wi-Fi password, which burner on the stove ran a little hot, how to work the dock light. Thoughtful. The kind of host message that makes you relax your shoulders a little. First night was everything we needed it to be. We cooked together, ate on the deck, watched the sun drop behind the tree line across the lake. The water went completely still around 9 and the reflection of the sky on it looked almost painted. We stayed outside until the bugs got bad. Then went inside, lit the fireplace, opened a second bottle of wine. We talked for a long time, the easy, unhurried kind of conversation you can only have when there's nowhere else to be. We went to bed late and slept with the sliding door cracked open so we could hear the water. I want to be precise about how normal and happy that night was. Because what happened the next morning only works if you understand that we had no reason to feel anything but completely at ease. The second morning, we woke up late, made coffee, sat on the deck in the cool air wrapped in the throw blankets we'd pulled off the couch. There was mist on the water. It was one of those mornings that feels almost too still. We sat there for maybe an hour, just drinking coffee and not saying much and being glad we'd stayed the extra night. Then around 11, a text came through from Glenn T. It was friendly in tone. Asked if we were enjoying our second morning. Said he hoped the weather was holding up for us. Then, and this is the line I've read back in my head probably several hundred times since, he said, "Hope you both slept well after that late night. The lake at night really is something special, isn't it?" I read it twice. Then I showed it to her. She read it, looked up at me. Read it again. Here is what the message could have meant. Glenn could have been making general conversation. He could have assumed, logically, that honeymooners on a lake weekend would stay up late. Late night could have been a generic pleasantry. Hosts say warm, personal-sounding things. That is the whole business model. We sat there on the deck and talked it through in low voices like we were trying to solve something. By the end of the conversation we had mostly convinced ourselves it was nothing. But neither of us fully believed that. And the problem with not fully believing something is that once the doubt is in, it starts touching everything retroactively. The warmth of his welcome message started to feel like something different. The detail about which burner ran hot, the firewood location, the dock light, all of it rearranged itself slightly in my memory into something that felt less like hospitality and more like familiarity. Like he knew the space in a way that was more current than it should have been. We stopped talking about it. We made lunch. We went for a swim. We were both doing the same thing, trying to put the morning back to how it had felt before 11 o'clock. Then she went inside to change and I stayed on the dock. And I started actually looking at the property the way you look at something when you're trying to find something. The tree line on the left side of the house was dense right up to within maybe 15 feet of the building. The trees were old and close together. Standing anywhere in that tree line at night, you would be completely invisible from the deck. The bedroom's sliding glass door, the one we'd cracked open to hear the water, faced the deck, and the deck faced the water. If someone was standing in those trees, they could see straight through the gap in that sliding door. I walked back up to the house and inside, and I said quietly that I thought we should check the smoke detectors. She looked at me and understood immediately what I meant. There were 4 smoke detectors in the house. 3 of them were standard white disc units screwed flat to the ceiling. The 4th one, in the living room, positioned on a bookshelf rather than the ceiling, angled slightly toward the couch, was a small black cylinder, about 4 inches tall, matte black plastic. I picked it up and turned it over. It had no brand markings on the back, no FCC ID, no UL certification stamp, which every legitimate smoke detector in North America is required by law to have. There was a small pinhole on the front face. I put it back down exactly as I'd found it, facing exactly the same direction. I walked to the bedroom and she was sitting on the edge of the bed, and I said, very quietly, "We need to pack right now, and we need to not act differently until we're in the car." We packed in under 10 minutes. We were calm about it. We left the throw blankets folded on the couch. We left the remaining wine on the kitchen counter. We rinsed our coffee mugs. We did all of these normal things while moving at a speed that was not normal at all, and then we picked up our bags and walked out to the car, and I put it in reverse and drove down the long pine flank driveway and turned onto the road toward the highway. We didn't speak for almost 20 minutes. The kind of silence that isn't comfortable and isn't angry, just stunned, processing. She was the one who finally said it out loud, that if the device was what we thought it was, it had been running the whole time. Both nights. Every conversation on that couch, every moment in that room, everything. I called Airbnb from the car while she drove. Reported the device, reported the text message, reported everything. The representative took notes and said the concern would be forwarded to their trust and safety team and that the listing would be reviewed. The listing was still active and visible when I checked that evening. It was gone the following morning. I found, in the weeks after, a Canadian federal statute, PIPEDA, the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act, that makes covert surveillance of guests in rental accommodations explicitly illegal. I sent the screenshots of the text message and the photos I'd taken of the device to a lawyer I knew. He said the photos alone were not definitive proof of a recording device specifically, that the object could theoretically be something else, but that the combination of the message and the device and the placement was, in his words, enough to make a very uncomfortable case. We filed a formal complaint. I don't know what came of it. Airbnb sent us a full refund and a message saying the matter had been addressed. Glenn T.'s profile disappeared from the platform within a few days of our report. Here is the thing about being surveilled that I didn't understand before this happened. The violation doesn't stay in the past where the event actually occurred. It follows you forward, because you don't know what was recorded. You don't know what was watched. You don't know who saw it or whether it still exists somewhere on a hard drive in a mid-50s man's house near a small town called Dwight. You can't unknow the possibility. What you can do, what we did, is stop sleeping with the door open. Stop feeling the specific uncomplicated happiness we'd felt on that deck the first morning, because that happiness was assembled under conditions we didn't actually understand. The detail I keep coming back to is the text message. Not the device, the text. Because the device might have had an innocent explanation, however unlikely. But the text message had no innocent explanation that held up for more than 30 seconds of scrutiny. He sent it deliberately. He wanted us to know, or at least to wonder. He wanted to leave something in us that we couldn't remove. That is not the behavior of someone who made a mistake or got careless. That is the behavior of someone who enjoys it. We still travel. We still book Airbnbs sometimes, when hotels don't make sense and the price is right. But we check every room. We check every bookshelf. We check every object that has a small dark circle on its face and no reason to be pointed at the couch. Every room. Every time. And we never sleep with the door open anymore. We chose Tbilisi because none of us had been to Georgia, the country, not the state, which we had to clarify to about 6 different people before the trip. 3 of us, a long weekend in early March, the kind of trip that comes together because someone sends a screenshot of cheap flights in a group chat at 11 p.m. and everyone says yes before they've really thought about it. That was us. Spontaneous in the way that only works when you're in your late 20s and your responsibilities haven't fully closed in yet. The apartment we booked was in the Old Town, Abenotabani district, which is the sulfur bath neighborhood. All of these ancient domed brick structures built over natural hot springs. The streets there are narrow and slightly tilted, and the buildings lean toward each other overhead like they're sharing a secret. It was exactly the kind of place that looks incredible in photos and feels even better in person. The listing had been posted by a host named Luca V. Profile photo of a thin man in a dark jacket, late 30s maybe, standing somewhere with mountains behind him. 4.7 stars. Around 40 reviews. Most of them mentioned how stylish the apartment was, how Luca was incredibly helpful, how he went above and beyond. One review used the phrase, "Feels like Luca thought of everything." We didn't think twice about it at the time. The apartment was on the third floor of a building that had no elevator and stairs worn smooth in the center from decades of use. The space itself was genuinely beautiful. Exposed stone walls, high ceilings, old wooden floors that had been refinished without losing their character. A kitchen with copper pots hanging from a rack. A living room with 2 deep sofas and a coffee table made from what looked like a reclaimed door. 3 bedrooms, which meant we each had our own space, which after years of shared hostel rooms felt almost decadent. Luca met us there in person to hand over the keys. This was the first thing that separated him from most Airbnb hosts we dealt with. No lockbox, no code. He was simply there when we arrived, standing in the doorway of the apartment with the keys already in his hand like he'd been waiting a while. He was exactly like his photo. Thin, dark jacket, a very precise kind of stillness about him. He gave us a tour of the apartment that was thorough to the point of being slightly unusual. He showed us which cabinet the extra towels were in, which window latch was stiff, which floorboard near the bathroom squeaked, and how to step around it. The level of detail was impressive. We thanked him and he left. First night was excellent. We went out, found a restaurant around the corner that a stranger on the street recommended. Ate too much, drank Georgian wine, which is unlike wine from anywhere else on the planet. Walked home along the river in the cold. The apartment was warm when we got back. We stayed up talking for an hour and went to bed. The next morning is where the first small thing happened. She'd put her headphones down on the kitchen counter the night before. She was specific about this later, specific in the way you are when you're trying to prove to yourself you're not losing your mind. On the counter, next to the fruit bowl, left earbud facing up. She came into the kitchen in the morning and they were on the coffee table in the living room. Folded. The case was closed. She mentioned it over breakfast in the way you mention something you're not sure is worth mentioning, with a kind of apologetic qualifier like, "This is probably nothing but." We ran through the obvious explanations. One of us had moved them without thinking. She'd misremembered where she'd put them. We were tired from travel. We settled on that and moved on. We spent the day doing what you do in Tbilisi, the Narikala fortress, the old town streets, the sulfur baths, which were extraordinary and strange and worth the trip by themselves. We got back to the apartment around 6 in the evening. This is when the second thing happened. He had left a note, paper folded once on the kitchen counter, handwritten in careful English. "Hope day was wonderful. Notice small issue with bathroom heating. I came in briefly to check. All is fine now. Please let me know if any concerns. Luca." We read it standing together in the kitchen. Then we reread it. He had been in the apartment while we were out. He hadn't texted to ask. He hadn't mentioned it when we arrived. He'd simply come in with his key while we were not there and left a note about it as though this were standard practice. We checked the bathroom. The heating worked fine. We had not noticed any issue with it. I sent him a message, politely, carefully, the way you word things when you're not sure yet what you're dealing with, saying we'd gotten his note, that the bathroom seemed fine, and just asking if he could let us know in advance next time before entering. He replied within minutes. His message said, "Of course, my apologies. Though I should mention I did text before coming. You may have missed it." We checked. All 3 of us checked. No text from Luca. Not on any of our phones. Not in the Airbnb message thread. Nothing. That should have been the moment we left. Looking back, it's obvious. But here's the thing about gaslighting that nobody tells you. It doesn't feel like gaslighting while it's happening. Feels like confusion. Feels like maybe you're wrong. The message he described sending was so specific and so confidently referenced that for about 20 minutes we were genuinely unsure. We went back through our messages more carefully. We checked spam. We checked the Airbnb app notification history. We found nothing because there was nothing to find. But the search itself had done something to our certainty. We were no longer standing on completely solid ground. We went out for dinner. While we were at the restaurant, the second friend, who is the most methodical of the three of us, the one who keeps receipts and screenshots everything on instinct, went back through the entire Airbnb conversation thread from the beginning. Every message Luca had sent since we'd booked. She read them all carefully, and then she said quietly that she thought some of the earlier messages sounded different now. Not different in content, different in tone. Like they'd been written with the full knowledge of how this stay was going to go. We went back to the apartment, and that night the three of us stayed in the living room and talked it through properly. By the end of that conversation, we had identified 4 separate things that didn't add up. The headphones, the note, the phantom text, and a 4th thing. The first friend had noticed that the small painting on the wall of his bedroom had been moved. He hadn't touched it. It had been hanging slightly to the left of where it now was. He was sure of this because he'd looked at it the night before specifically, thinking it was crooked, and decided it was actually level. Now it was in a different position entirely. Something had been moved in each of our rooms. We were certain of this. And we were also, by that point, beginning to not be certain of anything, because that is what this kind of sustained, low-level wrongness does to your ability to trust your own perceptions. The next morning, our last, he texted. Not about anything practical. Just a message that said, "Hope you all slept well. Last night's weather must have made for good sleeping. It had rained heavily in the night. We had all slept well, as a matter of fact, despite everything." The message was innocuous. It was also, somehow, the most unsettling thing he'd sent because it was so precisely calibrated. Not threatening, not overtly strange, just attentive, in the way that something is attentive when it has been watching. We checked out that morning without interacting with him directly. Dropped the keys in the bowl he'd indicated by the door, messaged him a brief and neutral, "Checking out now. Thanks," and left. He replied immediately, "So glad you enjoyed it. Hope Tbilisi treated you well." 5 words to describe a stay in which we had spent a significant portion of our time quietly questioning our own memories. We filed a report with Airbnb on the journey to the airport. Detailed it all, the unauthorized entry, the note, the missing text he claimed to have sent, the moved objects. The response was the standard one. They'd look into it, they'd be in touch. I've thought about it a lot since, what exactly he got out of it. Because nothing was stolen. Nothing overtly threatening happened. He never raised his voice, never made a direct threat, never did anything you could point to in isolation and say definitively that is wrong. Each individual incident had a possible innocent explanation. The headphones, misremembered. The note, overly attentive host. The text, technical glitch. The painting, we moved it ourselves and forgot. That's the architecture of it. Each piece individually deniable. Together, something else entirely. The one thing I keep returning to, that note on the counter. The careful handwriting. The detail about the bathroom heating that we had never reported and never noticed. He'd fabricated a reason to come inside and then documented his presence so deliberately it felt almost like a signature. Not an oversight. Not a mistake. A message, left folded on a kitchen counter in an apartment in Tbilisi, in handwriting so neat it looked practiced. The second friend still isn't sure. That's the part one find hardest to sit with. Even now, she'll sometimes say, "Yeah, but what if he did send the text and it just didn't come through? What if the heating thing was real and we just didn't notice? What if we were tired and anxious and we moved those things ourselves?" That's what he built. Not fear exactly. Not danger. Just a door he left slightly open in our heads that none of us have been fully able to close. The booking looked fine. That is the thing I keep coming back to when I try to explain this to people who weren't there. There was nothing about it that should have made us nervous. 4.6 stars. A beach access rental in Galveston, Texas, about 50 yards from the seawall. A 2-bedroom place on the ground floor of a raised house, which is how most of the older properties on that island are built. The living space elevated on stilts to deal with storm surge, with a ground-level area underneath that some owners have enclosed and converted into rentable space. Ours had its own entrance off the side of the building, A small kitchen, 2 bedrooms, a bathroom tiled entirely in an aggressively cheerful shade of turquoise. The host's name was listed as Denise P. Older woman in the profile photo, standing in what looked like a garden. The kind of listing that reads as completely ordinary because it is completely ordinary. A local renting out her converted ground floor to people who want cheap beach access without paying resort prices. We drove down from Houston on a Friday afternoon. 2 of us, a long weekend, no real agenda beyond sitting near water and not thinking about work. We've been friends since college, the kind of friendship that doesn't require much maintenance because the foundation is solid enough that you can go 2 months without talking and pick up exactly where you left off. The drive took about an hour. We got there around 5, found the entrance on the side of the building exactly where the listing said it would be, used the code for the keypad lock. The space was small but clean. The turquoise bathroom was as aggressively cheerful in person as it had looked in the photos. We put our bags down, walked the 2 blocks to the seawall, looked at the Gulf for a while, came back, ordered pizza, watched something on a laptop. A completely ordinary Friday night. The first time he came to the door was Saturday morning. Around 9:30. 3 hard knocks. Not a knock and wait, 3 hard, deliberate knocks, the kind that don't suggest a question so much as a statement. She answered it because she was closer to the door. The man standing there was somewhere in his 50s. Heavyset, wearing a work shirt with something embroidered on the chest that I couldn't read from across the room. He was standing too close to the door. Not aggressively, just closer than you'd stand if you were, say, delivering a package or checking a meter, like he was already planning to be inside. He said he was the property manager. Said he needed to check something with the water heater. She told him we just arrived the night before and hadn't had any water issues. He said it wasn't about us specifically, that there was a pressure thing he needed to look at in all the units. She told him she'd need to contact the host first before letting anyone in. He looked at her for a moment, just a beat too long, and then said, "Sure, no problem," and left. We messaged Denise P. immediately, asked if she'd sent a property manager by. She replied within a few minutes. She had not. She said she didn't use a property manager. She said if anyone came to the door again claiming to work for her, we should not let them in and should call her directly. We were unsettled but not yet frightened. People get the wrong unit sometimes. Maybe he had the wrong address. We went to the beach, spent most of the day on the seawall, ate lunch at a place that served shrimp in paper baskets, came back sunburned and tired in the mid-afternoon. We didn't think about him again until that evening. He came back at 7:15. Same 3 knocks. I answered this time. He was in the same work shirt. He looked, if anything, more settled than he had that morning. Like the hours in between had not been spent reconsidering but confirming. He said he'd spoken with Denise and that she'd given the okay for him to check the unit. I told him that we'd spoken with Denise too, that she'd said she had no property manager and had told us not to let anyone in. He looked at me with an expression that wasn't angry exactly, more like patient, in an unpleasant way, like he was deciding how much effort this was worth. Then he said, "Okay," and walked back toward the parking area at the front of the building. I closed the door and locked it. Both of us stood in the kitchen and looked at each other. We called Denise. She confirmed again that she had not spoken to him, had not given anyone permission to enter, and had no idea who this man was. Her voice had a different quality this time, tighter. She said she was going to make some calls and she'd get back to us. She also said, and I don't think she meant it to land the way it did, that the ground floor unit had been vacant for about 3 months before she'd listed it on Airbnb. That she'd done some renovations. That some of the neighbors had gotten used to having access to the space during that period and that she'd had to have a conversation or two about it. That sentence rearranged the last 9 hours considerably. He wasn't confused about the address. He wasn't a legitimate property manager who'd gotten his wires crossed. He was someone who had decided at some point during those 3 vacant months that the ground floor unit was accessible to him in some way, for storage, for shelter, for whatever reason people decide unoccupied spaces are available to them, and the presence of guests was an obstacle he was working around rather than a boundary he recognized. We pushed the small kitchen table against the door. I know that sounds like an overreaction, and I know it wouldn't have stopped anyone seriously determined. But there's something about having your hands do something physical when you're frightened, it helps. We checked the windows. The 2-bedroom windows were the older sliding type, aluminum frames, the kind that can be lifted out of their tracks if you know what you're doing. We closed them and put the provided window locks on little pin-style latches, and then put a rolled towel along the bottom of each one for reasons that were more psychological than practical. We talked about leaving. Genuinely, seriously talked about it. Weighing up the drive back to Houston in the dark versus staying in a place that now felt compromised. We decided to stay partly because we'd already paid, partly because neither of us wanted to drive 2 hours at night while this amped up, and partly because leaving felt like letting him win something, which is not a rational calculation in a safety situation but is a very human one. At 11:40 p.m., he came back for the third time. This time there was no knock. What woke me was sound from somewhere outside. Not at the door but at the side of the unit, near the bedroom windows. A slow, exploratory sound. The specific sound of someone testing something, a frame, a latch, a gap. Methodical, patient. The sound of someone who had decided that asking was done and something else was beginning. I woke her. We both sat in the dark and listened. She had her phone out, already dialed to 911, thumb on the call button. We did not speak. The sound moved from the window toward the rear of the unit, toward where the water heater was actually housed, in a small external closet accessible from the back of the building. We heard the closet door open, heard him in there for maybe 2 minutes, then quiet, then nothing. We called 911, told them what had happened, all 3 visits, the property manager claim, the sound at the window, the closet. 2 officers came within about 15 minutes. They walked the exterior. They found the water heater closet open. The interior latch had been turned. Inside the closet, among the pipes and the heater itself, they found a plastic storage bin pushed against the back wall. Inside the bin, some tools, a rain jacket, 2 cans of food, a phone charger. He had been using that closet as a storage space, probably for months. The officers took a report, said they'd canvassed the immediate area but that the individual was likely gone for the night. They did not find him. We locked the door behind them and did not sleep. In the morning we packed before 7, messaged Denise a summary of everything, and drove back to Houston. Denise was horrified. She gave us a full refund and said she was going to install a proper lock on the external closet immediately. She seemed genuinely shaken. I believed her. I found out about 2 weeks later, from a message Denise sent me, that she had identified the man from the property description we'd given. A neighbor from 2 houses down. She'd confronted him, apparently. He'd said, without much embarrassment, that the previous owner had let him use the space. The previous owner had sold the property 18 months ago. He had simply continued using it. When she told him about the guests, about us, about what he'd put us through across those 3 visits, he apparently shrugged. Denise said he didn't seem to feel he'd done anything wrong. She'd since had a formal no trespass notice issued. I think about that storage bin a lot. The rain jacket folded on top of the tools. The 2 cans of food. The phone charger. The life he'd assembled for himself in a closet behind someone else's wall. And the patience required to maintain it. To keep coming back, to keep checking, to wait out the people who were temporarily in his way. 3 visits in less than 36 hours. Each one more deliberate than the last. Not panicked. Not angry. Just patient. That word keeps coming back to me. Patient. It is not a word that should feel frightening. But context does a lot to a word. In the right circumstances, in the dark, with your thumb on the call button and a rolled towel against a window that won't really keep anyone out. Patient is one of the most frightening words there is. The listing described it as a working cattle station stay, which is apparently a category of rural tourism in Queensland that I had never heard of before and have thought about constantly since. The idea is straightforward enough. A working cattle property opens up a spare room or a small separate cottage to guests. You get the experience of staying on an actual functioning farm, wide open land, real agricultural operations happening around you, and the kind of silence that people from cities don't fully believe exists until they're inside it. The property was outside a town called Longreach, which sits more or less in the dead center of Queensland, roughly 8 hours of driving west of the coast. I booked it because I was doing a solo road trip across the interior, what Australians call the outback, though locals in Longreach will tell you that's a tourist word and the real term is just out west. I had 3 weeks, a rented four-wheel drive, and a deliberately loose itinerary. The cattle station stay was supposed to be 2 nights, a mid-trip break from driving, somewhere quiet to reset. The host's name on the listing was Ray C. No photo, which is less unusual on rural Australian listings than it would be in a city context. The profile description said he'd been hosting for 2 years, that the property had been in his family for 3 generations, that guests were welcome to watch the morning muster if they were up early enough, that the cottage was fully self-contained with its own small kitchen and bathroom. 11 reviews. Average 4.6. The reviews were uniformly positive but on the short side. Things like, beautiful property, very peaceful, Ray was helpful, and an incredible experience. Highly recommend the Outback Sky at night. None of them mentioned anything I'm about to tell you. I arrived in the late afternoon of a Tuesday. The drive from the highway turnoff to the homestead was about 12 kilometers of dirt road. Red dust, flat as a table, the kind of country that makes you feel very aware of how small a car is. The homestead itself was a low, wide building with a corrugated iron roof and a veranda running the full length of the front. Behind it were several outbuildings, a large machinery shed, what looked like a shearing shed, some stockyards, and to the right of the homestead, maybe 80 meters away, a small cottage. My cottage. It was simple and clean and exactly what was advertised. Ray met me in the yard. He was older than I'd expected from the 2-year hosting history. Somewhere in his late 60s, lean and weathered in the way that men get when they've spent decades outdoors. He was polite but not effusive, which felt right for the context. He showed me the cottage, pointed out the gas hot water system and how to light it, told me that the muster started at 5:30 a.m. if I wanted to watch. He mentioned, in passing, that the paddock to the east of the cottage, the one visible from the kitchen window, was currently empty of stock and I shouldn't be alarmed if I heard the gates. Then he walked back to the homestead without much ceremony. The first evening was everything the listing promised. I made dinner in the small kitchen, ate on the cottage's little front step, watched the light go out of the sky in a way that you genuinely cannot describe to someone who hasn't seen an outback sunset. The colors are too specific, too sustained, too strange. Then the dark came and it was absolute. No light pollution of any kind. The stars were architectural. I went to bed early, slept deeply, woke before the alarm at 5 and walked across to the yards to watch the muster. The muster was real and loud and involved dogs and horses and about 200 cattle moving in ways that seemed chaotic but clearly weren't. Ray worked with one other man. Younger, didn't speak to me, and 2 dogs that were extraordinary to watch. I stood at the fence for an hour and felt very urban and very glad to be there. By 7 it was over and Ray nodded at me across the yard and went about his morning. So far, nothing. So far, perfect. The second day is where it starts. I'd been out driving. There's a series of ancient river channels east of Longreach, dry now, that are worth seeing, and I came back to the cottage around 4 in the afternoon. I made tea and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the empty eastern paddock. It was empty as Ray had said it would be. Just red dirt and dry grass and a fence line and a gate at the far end. The gate was open. I looked at it for a moment. Ray had said I shouldn't be alarmed if I heard the gates. Maybe he'd been in there for some reason. Maybe it had blown open, though there was no wind. I drank my tea and kept looking at it, and eventually the light shifted and I stopped thinking about it. That night, the second night, my last night, I woke up at some point in the deep dark. I don't know what time. I hadn't checked and didn't want to reach for my phone. I lay there in the way you do when you're not sure what woke you, running a passive inventory of sounds. The cottage made very little noise. Outside was that absolute rural silence. Then it wasn't. Something was moving in the paddock. Not a small something. The sound had weight to it, the specific acoustic texture of a large animal moving across dry ground. Not a single animal either. Multiple. The sound of hooves on dirt, plural, irregular, unhurried. The kind of movement that isn't going anywhere in particular, just circling or grazing or existing in the dark. I lay there and told myself Ray had moved stock into the paddock. That was the obvious explanation. He was a cattle farmer. Moving cattle around at night was probably sometimes necessary for reasons I didn't understand. The gate had been open in the afternoon because he'd been preparing to move them in. I was a city person hearing farm sounds and constructing anxiety around them because I didn't have the context to normalize them. That was the rational explanation, and I held onto it. I did not get up. I did not look out the window. I want to be honest about that. I lay in the dark and I listened, and I decided not to look, which is a decision I've turned over many times since and still don't fully understand. Whether it was practical caution or something more instinctive. Whether some part of me had already decided I didn't want to see what was making that sound. After a while it stopped. I eventually slept. Morning. I packed my things, loaded the car, and walked over to the homestead to return the cottage key to Ray. He was on the veranda with a mug of tea. I handed him the key, thanked him. Then I mentioned, conversationally, that it sounded like he'd moved some cattle into the eastern paddock overnight. He looked at me. Then he looked toward the eastern paddock. Then back at me. He said the eastern paddock had been empty for 6 weeks. He said he hadn't been in it since he'd moved the last group out. He said the gate was kept latched from the outside with a chain and that the latch needed 2 hands to operate. I looked at the paddock. From where we were standing on the veranda, I could see the far gate. It was closed. The paddock was empty. Red dirt. Dry grass. Nothing. I asked him if there were other large animals in the area, wild ones. Feral cattle, maybe, which I knew were a problem in some parts of Queensland. He said there were feral pigs in the wider district, but nothing large enough to make the kind of sound I was describing, and nothing that could operate a 2-handed gate latch from inside a paddock. He said all of this in the same unhurried, matter-of-fact way he'd said everything else. Then he took a sip of his tea and looked at the paddock again and said, very quietly, almost to himself, "3rd time this year someone's mentioned that paddock. I wanted to ask him what the other 2 times had been. I wanted to ask him what he thought it was. I wanted to ask him about the gate, whether he'd checked it that day and found it open or closed, whether he had any theory at all. I didn't ask any of it. I'm not sure why. Maybe because of the tone he'd used, quiet, private, the tone of a man who had already made a decision about this thing, who had filed it in a category of things that don't get discussed in the daylight on a veranda, and I got the strong sense that pushing it would be unwelcome. Like there was a boundary there that had nothing to do with hostility and everything to do with whatever it was he'd decided to believe or not believe about his own land. I said it had probably been the wind and that the stay had been wonderful. He nodded. I got in the car. I left a review. For stars, I dropped 1 not because anything had been wrong exactly, but because I wasn't sure what else to do with it. I wrote that the property was beautiful and the muster was a highlight. I said the cottage was clean and comfortable. I said nothing about the paddock or the gate or the sounds in the dark. 3 weeks later, Airbnb sent me the automatic notification that the host had responded to my review. I almost didn't read it. His response to my 4-star review, in full exactly as he wrote it, was 7 words. "Glad you enjoyed your stay. Come back." That was it. No mention of the missing star. No, let me know if anything was less than perfect. No defensive explanation. Just 7 words that somehow managed to read, in the context of everything, less like an invitation and more like something else entirely. A sentence that has no business being unsettling, and yet, I have not gone back. The flat was listed as a converted warehouse space in the Sydenham area of Christchurch, which, if you don't know Christchurch, is a city that spent most of the last decade rebuilding itself after the 2011 earthquake, and there's this whole category of architecture there now that came out of that rebuilding, these industrial conversions and temporary structures that became permanent, corrugated iron and exposed concrete and reclaimed timber used in ways that feel simultaneously makeshift and deliberate. The flat fit that aesthetic exactly. High ceilings, concrete floors, big steel-framed windows. The listing photos made it look like a magazine shoot. 4.7 stars, 60-something reviews, hosted by someone listed as Joe W. Profile photo of a smiling woman in her 40s, short hair. The kind of photo that communicates warmth and competence simultaneously. I was in Christchurch for work, a conference that ran Thursday through Saturday, and I'd decided to tack on Sunday and Monday to see the city properly since I'd never been and the flights had been cheap. I'm from Auckland, so New Zealand travel doesn't feel like a big undertaking, but Christchurch has a different energy to it. A city still in the process of deciding what it wants to be, and I was genuinely curious about it. The flat was in my price range, the location was good, and the reviews were strong. I booked 2 nights, Saturday and Sunday. I checked in Saturday afternoon, after the last conference session. Used the code Joe had sent, let myself in. The flat was exactly like the photos, maybe better actually, because photos don't capture ceiling height or the specific quality of light through those big steel windows in the late afternoon. I put my bag down and stood in the middle of the space for a moment, just appreciating it. Then I noticed the other key on the hook by the door. Joe's instructions had said to use the hook by the door for my key. There was a hook, and on it was already a key. Not the one I just used, which was still in my hand, but another one. Same style, same keyring. I stood there looking at it. The flat was listed as a full private rental. Not a room in a shared space, not a hosted situation, just me with a private flat for 2 nights. There should not have been another key.
I messaged you.
She replied quickly. Said the other key was a spare she'd forgotten to remove and I should just leave it on the hook. I did. I put both keys on the hook and told myself that was the explanation and went out to explore the city. I came back around 10, made tea, read for an hour, went to bed. I woke up at some point in the night. I don't know what time, I hadn't checked, to the sound of the front door. Not the sound of someone trying the door. The sound of a key in the lock. The specific mechanical sound of a deadbolt turning. I was sitting up before I was fully awake. The bedroom in the flat was separated from the main living area by a partial wall. Not a full wall, more of a divider that went about 3/4 of the way to the ceiling, which meant I could hear everything in the main space but couldn't see it from the bed without getting up. I heard the door open, heard it close, heard footsteps on the concrete floor, unhurried, familiar, the footsteps of someone who knew where they were going. I want to describe what that specific fear feels like because I don't think people who haven't experienced it quite understand it. It's not the sharp adrenaline of something jumping out at you. It's a cold, spreading thing that starts in your chest and moves outward, and the worst part of it is the interval, the seconds between realizing something is wrong and understanding how wrong. Your brain keeps trying to give you explanations because explanations are better than the alternative. I lay there and I thought, Joe, checking something, a cleaner who had the schedule wrong, the neighbor with the wrong flat. I ran through all of them in about 4 seconds. Then the footsteps stopped, and I heard a voice, low male, speaking quietly. Then another voice, female, responding. 2 people, in the flat, at whatever this hour was. I got up. There was no other option. The bedroom had no lock and no window I could exit from, and my phone was on the nightstand and I needed it in my hand. I picked it up, already dialing nothing but ready to dial. Stepped around the partition wall. There were 2 people in the living area of the flat. A man and a woman, probably late 30s, both dressed for outdoors, jackets, boots. They were standing near the kitchen counter, and when I came around the partition they both looked at me without alarm. That was the first wrongness. Most people, walking into a flat in the middle of the night and finding a stranger standing there in his socks holding a phone, would react with some version of surprise or apology. These 2 looked at me the way you look at something you were already aware of and had already decided how to handle. The man spoke first. He said something like, "Sorry to disturb, we're friends of Joe's. She said we could store some things here tonight and grab them early before you checked out." His tone was easy, slightly apologetic, but only slightly, in the way of someone who doesn't consider the apology especially necessary. I said that Joe had not told me about this. He said she must have forgotten to mention it. The woman had moved slightly, not toward me, just a repositioning, and I noticed she'd placed herself between me and the front door in a way that was probably coincidental, and yet. I said I'd like to contact Joe directly to confirm. He said, of course, absolutely, go ahead. The ease of it was what kept catching me. There was no defensive response, no heightened energy, just a kind of settled patience, like they'd had some version of this conversation before and knew how it went. I messaged Joe from where I was standing. 3 a.m. Christchurch time. I was fairly sure she was asleep and wouldn't respond for hours, and these 2 people knew that. I said to the man that I wasn't comfortable with them being in the flat until I'd heard from Joe and asked if they could wait outside. He looked at me for a moment, smiled just slightly, not warmly, and said sure. They went to the door. The woman went first. The man paused in the doorway and looked back at me and said, "We'll be just outside," in a tone that was perfectly pleasant and completely terrible. I locked the door behind them. Then I stood in the middle of that flat at 3 in the morning and thought about what had just happened, and the more I thought about it, the worse it got. They had a key. They had a key to this flat, Joe's spare key that she told me was just a forgotten spare. And these two people had it, and they'd used it in the middle of the night, and they'd walked in with the specific confidence of people who had done this before in this flat with other guests. I pushed the couch against the door. I know, but I pushed it. Joe replied to my message at 3:47. Her message said she was so sorry, she'd forgotten to mention. They were old friends who needed to collect some camping equipment stored in the flat storage cupboard. They'd be quick. I replied that they'd already come and gone as far as I was concerned, and that I needed her to confirm they no longer had access to the flat. She said she'd collect the spare key from them in the morning. Not, I'll tell them they can't come back. Not, I'm so sorry, this won't happen again. She'd collect the key in the morning. Which meant right now, at 3:48 a.m., they still had it. I did not sleep. I lay on the couch with my back against the armrest and the couch still pushed against the door, and I watched the pale rectangle of light visible above the partition wall. The window, which let in a small amount of the ambient glow from the street, and I listened to the flat. The building had its own sounds. Pipes, the steel frames flexing in the wind. Somewhere above me, footsteps, another tenant or maybe not. At around 5:15 am I heard them come back. Not the key this time. A knock. Soft, rhythmic, 3 knocks and then a pause and then 2 more. Like a pattern. Like something agreed upon. I did not move. I lay on the couch and I did not make a sound, and after about 2 minutes the knocking stopped. At 6 I got up, packed everything I had, and left the flat. I didn't take my key off the hook. I didn't leave a note. I went downstairs and stood on the street in the early cold of a Christchurch Sunday morning and called a taxi. I reported everything to Airbnb that morning: the unauthorized entry, the key, Joe's non-response, the pattern knock at 5 a.m. The investigation took 11 days. At the end of it, Airbnb sent me a message saying the listing had been suspended pending further review. I got a full refund. I looked at the reviews again, the way you do after something happens when you want to find the signs you missed. Most of them were entirely normal, but there were 2 buried in the middle, months apart, that had single sentences I'd skimmed past when I booked. One said, "Slightly odd experience with other guests. Wouldn't stay again." The other said, "Lovely flat, but felt like it wasn't quite as private as advertised." That second one. Felt like it wasn't quite as private as advertised. 12 words that were doing an enormous amount of work. 12 words from someone who had probably lain awake in that flat the same way I had and decided, in their review, to go no further than that. I think about that knock a lot. The pattern of it, 3 and then 2. The fact that it was a pattern at all. You don't develop a knock pattern for a one-time errand. You develop it for a system. Something practiced, something with history. Something that had been running quietly inside that 4.7-star listing for longer than anyone who booked it had any idea. The listing had no reviews. That was the first thing I should have paid more attention to. Not because 0 reviews is automatically suspicious on Airbnb, new listings exist, hosts start somewhere, but because of the combination. 0 reviews and a price point that was, for Montreal in late September, genuinely remarkable. The apartment was listed at $64 Canadian a night. For a 2-bedroom in the Plateau Mont-Royal neighborhood, which is one of the more desirable areas of the city. Tree-lined streets, good restaurants, close to everything. $64 was not a deal. It was an anomaly. I noticed it and I booked it anyway because I was 28 and I was traveling alone, and $64 felt like found money, and I told myself new hosts sometimes underpriced to get their first reviews. The listing photos were beautiful. Not professionally shot, but whoever had taken them had a good eye, warm light, interesting angles, the kind of photos that feel intimate rather than staged. A living room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves along one wall. A reading chair angled toward a window that looked out onto a street lined with the specific maples that make Montreal in autumn look like a painting. A kitchen with open shelving, mismatched but deliberate, the kind of kitchen that accumulates character over years rather than being purchased all at once. A bedroom with a quilt that looked handmade. It was a beautiful apartment. The photos made that completely clear. What I did not think about, looking at those photos, was that they were too good. Not too good in the sense of overstyled or filtered, too good in the sense of too lived in. Too specific. The books on those shelves weren't decorative. They were organized, annotated, the kind of collection that takes years to build and represents an actual person's actual mind. The kitchen's open shelving held things: a specific brand of tea, a French press with a worn handle, a ceramic bowl with keys and coins in it. The reading chair had a side table with a half-burned candle and a paperback left face down, spine up, like someone had just stood up from it. I did not think about any of this when I booked. I looked at those photos and thought, charming. I did not think, inhabited. I arrived on a Wednesday evening, late September. The kind of Montreal evening where the air has just turned cold enough to make the falling leaves feel intentional. The building was on Rue Rachel Estate, a 3-story walk-up with an exterior staircase, those iconic Montreal exterior iron staircases that you see in every photo of the city. The host's name on the listing was M. Fortin. The instructions said the door code for the building was 3847, that the apartment was on the 2nd floor, Unit 2, and that the key would be in a lockbox attached to the stair railing, code 9914. The code worked. The key was there. I let myself in. The apartment was exactly like the photos. Exactly. The bookshelves, the reading chair, the kitchen with the open shelving. The ceramic bowl with keys and coins in it. I stopped and looked at that bowl specifically, because there were keys in it. Not one spare set left for a guest. For separate keyrings, each with multiple keys, the kind of accumulation that happens when you live somewhere for years and never clear out the old ones. I stood in the kitchen and looked at those keys and felt the first faint edge of something I couldn't name yet. I put my bag in the 2nd bedroom. The listing had described it as the guest bedroom, smaller than the main one, with a single bed and a window onto the interior courtyard. The room was clean. The bed was made with fresh sheets. There was a small folded towel on the pillow the way hotels do it. Everything correct, everything prepared. I unpacked a few things, freshened up, and went out for dinner. I came back around 10, poured a glass of water in the kitchen, sat in the reading chair, the beautiful one by the window, and looked out at the street for a while. And that's when I started actually looking at the apartment the way I should have looked at it 3 hours earlier. The bookshelf. The books weren't just organized, they were organized in a system. Fiction alphabetical by author, non-fiction by subject, a whole shelf of French-language titles separated from the English. There were penciled annotations visible in some of the paperbacks whose spines faced out. There was a bookmark in a novel on the 2nd shelf, a proper bookmark, a leather one, placed about 2/3 through. Someone had been reading that book and had stopped 2/3 through, and the book was sitting there waiting for them to come back to it. I got up and went to the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, which I hadn't done earlier. It was not empty the way an Airbnb refrigerator is empty. Cleared out, maybe a courtesy water bottle, maybe some condiments left for guests. It was stocked. Fully, specifically stocked. Leftover food in containers with lids. A block of cheese with a corner cut off. Half a bottle of white wine. A drawer full of vegetables. Some of them slightly past their best. This was not hospitality provisioning. This was someone's week of groceries. I closed the refrigerator very slowly. I stood in that kitchen in Montreal and I did an inventory of every conclusion I had been avoiding since I walked in. The keys in the bowl. The half-read book. The food in the refrigerator. The specific, accumulated, irreplaceable character of everything in this apartment that could not have been assembled for the purpose of short-term rental because it had not been assembled at all. It had simply accrued, the way a life accrues, over years of actually living somewhere. This was not an Airbnb. This was someone's home. I opened the listing on my phone and looked at the photos again, and this time I looked at them differently. I found the bowl of keys in one of the kitchen photos, visible in the background. I found what I now realized was the edge of a prescription medication bottle on the bathroom shelf, cropped almost out of frame. I found, in the living room photo, a framed photograph on the far bookshelf that I'd registered as generic decoration. But looking at it now, zoomed in as far as my phone camera would go, it was a specific photograph of specific people. Family. Somewhere outdoors. The kind of photograph that exists in exactly one copy in the world. I went to the main bedroom. I had not gone in there yet. It was listed as the host's private space, not available to guests, and I'd respected that. I stood in the doorway without crossing the threshold. The bed was made, but not in the crisp, neutral way of a prepared guest room. It was made the way a person makes their own bed in the morning. Slightly uneven, a pillow pushed more to one side, the duvet pulled up but not straightened. There was a glass of water on the nightstand. Not empty. Full or nearly full. Still present. Someone had been sleeping in this bed recently. Not weeks ago. Recently. I went back to the living room and sat down and thought about the geometry of this very carefully. A two-bedroom apartment. One bedroom prepared for a guest, with fresh sheets and a folded towel. One bedroom that was, and I was now certain of this, in current, active, ongoing use by someone who lived here. The refrigerator stocked with their food. Their books on the shelves. Their keys in the bowl. Where were they right now? I looked at the apartment with completely new eyes. There was a second door off the hallway that I'd taken for a closet. I hadn't opened it. I got up and opened it. It was a closet, full of coats and shoes and a vacuum cleaner and the dense, compressed evidence of someone's storage habits. Not staged. Not curated. Person's actual closet. I looked at the coat rack inside it. Several coats of varying weights. A rain jacket. A heavy winter parka, which you would not have taken with you in late September in Montreal when it wasn't cold enough yet for a parka. You'd have left it in the closet. You'd have left it there and gone out in something lighter and expected to come back to it. I packed my bag. I did not pack slowly. I moved through that apartment collecting my things with a speed that was not quite panic but was adjacent to it, the kind of movement that happens when your body has understood something before your reasoning has fully caught up. I checked the bathroom for my toiletries. I went back to the guest room for the last of my things. I put my shoes on standing by the front door. Then I stopped. The building was quiet. The street outside the window was normal foot traffic, a passing car, Montreal on a Wednesday night. Nothing was wrong in any visible, immediate sense. And yet I was standing by the door with my bag on my shoulder and my coat in my hand, and I was absolutely certain I wanted to be on the other side of it. I left, locked the door, put the key back in the lockbox. I called Airbnb from the exterior staircase. Told them everything, the food, the keys, the bed, the closet, the coats. The representative asked me to stay on the line while she reviewed the listing. There was a pause of about 3 minutes. Then she said that the listing had been flagged before. Once, a few weeks ago, a guest complained they were still investigating. She said she was escalating immediately and asked if I needed emergency accommodation arranged. I did. She arranged it. I walked to a hotel 4 blocks away and checked in at 11:30 p.m. and sat on the edge of a clean, anonymous, deeply comforting hotel bed and stared at the wall for a while. I checked Airbnb the next morning. The listing was gone. Not suspended, gone. Fully removed, as though it had never existed. I've turned the question over many times since. Whether the person who lived there knew a guest was coming. Whether they'd listed their own home deliberately, taken the money, and simply gone out for the evening planning to return after I was asleep. Whether they knew I'd found something and left. Whether they came back that night to a locked apartment with a key back in the lockbox and understood what that meant. And sometimes, the version that sits least comfortably, whether they were there the whole time. Not gone for the evening. Not out. Just quiet in a space I hadn't checked. In a home that was theirs, waiting with the specific patience of someone who had done this before and knew that most guests, when they find a bowl of keys and a half-read book and a stocked refrigerator, will tell themselves there's a reasonable explanation. Will pour a glass of water. Will sit in the reading chair. Will stay.